April 6, 1986. Gallup, New Mexico. A 9-year-old girl named Antoinette Calladito goes to sleep in the small house she shares with her mother and 2 younger sisters. It's a quiet night. No sounds, but the wind outside and the hum of the desert. Around 3 a.m., there's a knock at the door. One of the younger sisters hears it. She says Antoinette gets up, half asleep, to see who it is. A man's voice calls her name. Antoinette. Then, silence. By morning, she's gone. No signs of forced entry, no broken glass. Just a blanket missing from her bed, and a front door that shouldn't have been unlocked. Days turn into weeks. The search spreads from Gallup to the desert beyond. Police, neighbors, strangers combing the dust and scrub for any trace of her. Nothing. A year later, a phone rings at the Gallup Police Department. On the other end is a young girl's voice, shaking, terrified.
I'm Antoinette. Please come get me.
Before the dispatcher can answer, a man's voice cuts in, harsh and commanding. Then, the line goes dead. The call is never traced, the voice never identified, and Antoinette never found. For her family, that moment becomes a loop, a single phrase echoing through decades of silence. Was it really her? Was she still alive? Or was it someone using her name to keep the pain alive? No one knows. But it wouldn't be the last time a voice reached out from the unknown, because just a few years earlier, hundreds of miles away, another call came. This time, from a man who had already vanished and was calling for help. Don Kemp, November 15th, 1982. Wyoming. A lone Chevrolet Blazer sits abandoned on the shoulder of Highway 80. Doors unlocked, engine off, keys still in the ignition. Inside the vehicle are neatly packed clothes, a few notebooks, a half-eaten sandwich, and several books about Abraham Lincoln. The man who left it there, Don Kemp, is gone. For most of his life, Don had been the picture of stability, an advertising executive in New York City, known for his sharp mind and quiet confidence. Then, one winter night, he was in a serious car accident. He survived, but something in him broke loose afterward. He became withdrawn, distant. He talked less about work and more about destiny, solitude, and finding meaning in history. Friends said he'd become fascinated, obsessed even, with the life and death of Abraham Lincoln. He told them he was writing a book that would uncover hidden truths about the assassination. He said he needed time alone, away from the noise of the city, to finish it. So he sold most of what he owned, packed his car, and drove west, toward Wyoming, toward silence. When police discovered his abandoned car, it looked almost staged, tidy, deliberate, as if he'd planned to come back soon. A single line of footprints led away from the road and into the open plains. They stretched on for a few hundred yards, then simply stopped. No sign of where he'd gone next. Search teams scoured the area, helicopters traced the rolling hills. Locals joined in, calling his name across the cold Wyoming air. But the plains stayed silent. It was as though Don had stepped out of the world and into the void. Weeks passed, then months. The case faded from headlines until it seemed destined to be another story, swallowed by the wilderness, until the phone calls began. Hundreds of miles away, in New York City, Don's close friend Judith returned home one night to find her answering machine blinking. She pressed play and froze. The voice on the tape was faint, shaky, filled with static. It was Don. He said he was trapped. He said he needed help. He said he couldn't get out. Judith sat frozen, replaying it again and again. She hadn't spoken to Don since before his disappearance. Her phone number was unlisted, known only to a handful of people. There was no reason he should have been able to reach her at all. But the calls didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, more messages arrived. Each time, the same voice, weak, frightened, sometimes whispering as if afraid of being overheard. Sometimes he spoke in fragments, describing roads or towns that didn't exist. Other times, he simply said her name. Judith went to the police, Investigators traced the calls back to a single phone line in Casper, Wyoming, roughly 200 miles from where Don's car had been found. The line belonged to a man named Mark Dennis, a quiet, middle-aged resident with no criminal record and no known connection to Don. Dennis didn't resist when police knocked on his door. He invited them in, let them inspect the phone, answered every question they had. He said he didn't know Don Kemp. He'd never met anyone named Judith. And he had no idea why calls to a private number in New York would appear to have come from his phone. The line wasn't faulty. It was a standard home connection, nothing unusual. Yet somehow, it had reached across the country to deliver the voice of a man who shouldn't have been alive. The investigation hit a dead end. No evidence of tampering. No sign that Mark Dennis had faked anything. And the calls eventually stopped, as abruptly as they'd begun. But 6 years later, in 1988, hunters stumbled upon human remains in the hills, not far from where Don's blazer had been discovered. Dental records confirmed they belonged to him. There were no injuries, no signs of foul play, only the quiet suggestion that he had walked out into the cold and never made it back. But that discovery only deepened the mystery. If Don Kemp had died in the wilderness, who or what had been calling Judith's unlisted number months after his disappearance? Some say it was a cruel hoax, a stranger who'd seen the case in the papers and wanted attention. Others believe Don survived longer than anyone realized, wandering the plains, delirious, and somehow finding a way to reach out before the end. But those who've heard the original recordings describe something different, a tone that doesn't sound like confusion or madness. It sounds like terror, like someone realizing they're still here, but not where they should be. The voice on the tape fades with a click, and then only static remains. Static that hums like the Wyoming wind. To this day, no one can explain how those calls were made, or how they found their way to an unlisted apartment in New York City. It remains one of the strangest missing person mysteries in American history. And yet, as unsettling as Don Kemp's case is, it was only the beginning. Because just a few years later, another phone began to ring, this time in Montana. And the voice on the other end didn't claim to be lost. It claimed to be the man who took her. Nylene Marshall. June 25, 1983. Helena National Forest, Montana. A summer afternoon. Sunlight dripping through the trees, the smell of pine needles and river water, and the distant sound of laughter drifting through Beartooth Picnic Area. Families are gathered across the clearing, cooking, talking, children darting through the grass. Among them is 4-year-old Nylene K. Marshall, a quiet, curious girl with brown hair and soft eyes. She's barefoot, her feet coated in dust, running and laughing with a few other kids. The group begins a game, one the children call Follow the Shadow. They chase each other down a narrow trail that snakes into the woods. At one point, a stranger appears, a man wearing a purple jogging suit, standing just off the path. One child later recalls him watching silently, smiling faintly, as the others run past. He says Nylene stopped to talk to him. Moments later, she's gone. At first, no one notices. The children return to the picnic, breathless and giggling. Her mother, Nancy, asks where she is. The answers are scattered. Someone says she stayed behind. Someone else thinks she went back to the stream. But when minutes stretch into half an hour, panic takes over. Nancy and the other adults begin calling her name, their voices echoing through the trees. By evening, the forest fills with the light of flashlights and the sound of shouting, searchers combing every path, every creek, every hollow. Dogs pick up faint scents that fade into the wind. Helicopters sweep overhead. But there's no sign of her. It's as if Nylene simply dissolved into the woods. Days pass. Weeks. Reporters descend on the area, drawn by the growing mystery. There's talk of a suspicious car seen nearby, a man jogging alone on the highway. Nothing leads anywhere. By the end of summer, the case goes cold. Then, nearly 2 years later, the phone rings. In 1985, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children begins receiving a series of calls from an anonymous man. His voice is calm, soft, unsettlingly composed. He says he's the one who took Nylene. He He says she's alive. He says he's raising her himself. At first, investigators think it's a hoax until he begins describing things no one could know. He mentions a small mark on Nyleen's body, a detail never released publicly. He says her permanent teeth are beginning to come in, a fact that would have matched her age perfectly at that point in time. He claims to be wealthy, that he lives comfortably off investments. He says he travels often, that he educates Nyleen himself. He insists she is happy, that he provides for her, that he loves her. And every time the calls are traced, he's already gone. Investigators finally manage to lock onto one of the calls. It comes from Madison, Wisconsin. Another, from a pharmacy payphone in the small town of Edgerton nearby. By the time police arrive, the booths are empty. The callers long vanished into the background noise of the ordinary world. Then the letters begin to arrive, typed, no signature. Each one repeating the same story, the same justification. He writes about teaching Nyleen at home, about traveling with her, about giving her a better life. He writes as if he's proud of what he's done, as if the act of abduction was something noble. One letter reads, "I am the one who took Nyleen. She is safe. She plays with other children. She is happy. She is loved." The tone is clinical, detached, emotionless, the kind of calm that chills more than anger ever could. Every letter includes another small detail that matches the girl who vanished in the forest. And yet, every lid collapses. The man is never found. Years later, Nancy Marshall receives one final call. This time, the voice doesn't speak. It breathes, steady, deliberate, like someone listening on the other end. Then the line clicks. Nancy never stopped searching for her daughter. Even after moving to another state, even after the trail had long gone cold, she kept her number listed, just in case Nyleen might call home. In 1995, while traveling in Mexico, Nancy was tragically murdered during a robbery. Her death ended the family's hope of ever hearing that voice again. Nyleen's case remains open. There are no confirmed sightings, no physical evidence, no trace of what happened to her after that day in the woods. Only a handful of calls, a few typed pages, and the sound of a voice claiming to have given her a better life. Was he really her abductor? A man who believed he'd saved her from something unseen? Or a stranger who had studied every word printed about the case until he could impersonate truth itself? No one knows, but the details, the purple jogging suit, the barefoot child, the eerie precision of those calls, still haunt investigators. Because whoever that man was, he reached through wires and distance to prove something terrifying. Sometimes, the missing aren't lost in silence. Sometimes, they're hidden in plain sight. And the only proof they ever existed comes from the other end of a phone line. And while the calls for Nyleen stopped, the pattern didn't. Because years later, across the ocean, another voice would break the silence. This time, not from an abductor or a stranger, but from a daughter dialing her mother's number, a number that should have led to nowhere. Isabella Helena Zabłocka, Derby, England, 2010. It's a quiet Sunday morning on a modest suburban street, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where gardens are trimmed, curtains drawn, and life feels unremarkably safe. That morning, Isabella Helena Zabłocka leaves her small terraced house with a list of errands in her bag and a promise to her daughter that she'll be home by lunch. Her daughter's name is Katarzyna, though everyone calls her Kasia. She's 9 years old, wide-eyed, restless, and glued to the window as her mother walks away. That was the last time she saw her. When hours passed with no sign of Isabella, Kasia began to worry. She called her mother's phone again and again, the ringtone echoing through the empty house. On the third try, someone answered. It wasn't her mother. It was a man. A quiet, measured voice. He said one word, "Hello," and waited. Kasia asked, "Where's my mum?" There was a pause, then a faint click, and the line went dead. That call became a sound she would never forget. Her first memory of fear, and the first thread of a mystery that would stretch across 15 years. At first, police believed Isabella had left by choice. She was 36, independent, with no sign of forced entry or struggle. Her handbag and phone were missing, but her clothes, passport, and personal papers were untouched. She had debts, they said. She might have needed time away. But Kasia refused to believe it. She knew her mother. She knew she wouldn't just walk out of her life, not without her daughter. Days turned into weeks. Search teams combed the nearby parks, canals, and back streets. Friends and neighbors gave statements. Every lead ended the same way. Nowhere. The trail went cold. Years passed. The calls stopped. The phone was disconnected. And the voice on the other end, that quiet, unsettling hello, became more memory than clue. By 2025, Kasia is 24. She still lives in Derby, only a few streets from where she grew up, though everything about that neighborhood feels different now. The same houses, the same gardens, but silence where there should have been answers. Then, 15 years after her mother vanished, a fresh police appeal brings new movement. Detectives reopen the case, armed with better technology and new forensic methods. They start again from the beginning, retracing every step, rechecking old reports, scanning the neighborhood she disappeared from. And that's when they find it. Not far from Isabella's former home, in the back garden of another house on the same street, the soil shows signs of recent disturbance. Police cordon off the area, and a slow, methodical excavation begins. Within hours, they uncover human remains. Dental records confirm what everyone had quietly feared. Isabella Helena Zabłoka had been there the entire time, buried just a few doors down from her own home. Neighbors watch from behind curtains as police tents rise and forensic teams move in and out of the garden. Some can't believe it. They'd lived there for years, cutting their lawns, hosting barbecues, walking their dogs, never realizing what lay beneath the soil. For Kasia, the discovery is both an ending and the return of a nightmare. Because if her mother had died in 2010, that means the man who answered her mother's phone that day wasn't a wrong number or a coincidence. He was the one who buried her. And he'd been living right there, close enough to hear the search parties, close enough to watch the police look for a body he already knew would never be found. Investigators believe Isabella was killed the day she disappeared. Her body hidden quietly in that garden, the phone destroyed, the truth buried under years of routine life. The man long suspected of involvement died before the case was reopened, taking whatever explanation he might have given with him. Kasia visits the site often. There's no grave marker yet, just the small patch of earth where police dug down to the truth. She says she can still hear that voice in her head sometimes, that single word that has followed her for half her life. Hello, a greeting that was never meant to be one. And though her mother's story has finally found an ending, it's one that haunts everyone who's heard it. Because it reminds us that not every disappearance hides in the wilderness or behind oceans or across borders. Sometimes the missing never leave at all. Sometimes they're right there, beneath the surface of ordinary life, waiting to be found. And while this case ended in truth, the next one would only deepen the unease, because the next voice to reach across the years didn't belong to a stranger or a murderer. It came from a boy who vanished in the early hours of an Iowa morning, and years later called home. Johnny Gosch, West Des Moines, Iowa. September 5th, 1982. The sun hadn't yet risen when Johnny Gosch, a 12-year-old boy with sandy hair and freckles, left his house to deliver the morning paper. He'd done it every weekend since spring. Careful, dependable, a small part of the neighborhood's routine. Beside him trotted Gretchen, his miniature dachshund puppy, her short legs working twice as hard to keep up with his stride. Together, they disappeared down the quiet street, the red wagon of newspapers rattling softly behind them. It was an ordinary start to a Sunday. But within an hour, the quiet would turn to panic. By 7 a.m., neighbors noticed uncollected papers at the corner of 42nd Street and Marcour Lane. Then, Gretchen came running home alone, leash dragging behind her, trembling and confused. When Johnny's parents, Noreen and John Gosch, realized he hadn't returned, they called the police immediately. Witnesses later described a blue two-tone Ford Fairmont parked nearby, and a man speaking to Johnny. Another man stood watching from the sidewalk. One neighbor remembered hearing Johnny's voice, polite but uneasy. "No, sir. I don't need help." Moments later, the car sped away. Johnny was gone. The police response was painfully slow. In 1982, local law required a 72-hour waiting period before a child could be listed as missing, unless there was clear evidence of foul play. That hesitation, 3 days of inaction, would become one of the most criticized moments in the history of missing child investigations. By the time a formal search began, the trail was already cold. Hundreds of volunteers canvassed the area. Dogs searched the fields. Nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing. Nothing to explain how a 12-year-old boy and his papers could simply vanish. Weeks after the disappearance, a photograph appeared. It was mailed anonymously to a newspaper in Florida. The image showed 3 boys lying side by side, gagged and bound. One of them, Noreen said, was Johnny. Police said the photo was unverified, maybe a hoax, maybe unrelated. But for Noreen, it was the first proof she'd been right all along. Johnny hadn't run away. He'd been taken. She became one of the loudest voices in America for missing children, turning her grief into activism. She spoke before Congress, pushed for legislation, and helped create the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and what became known as the Johnny Gosch Bill, requiring police to act immediately when a child is reported missing. But even as laws changed, her son's case didn't. It remained a mystery built on whispers, and then, one night, on a voice. Several years after Johnny's disappearance, Noreen received a phone call just after midnight. The line clicked, and a young man's voice came through. Quiet, steady, trembling. "Mom," he said. "It's me. It's Johnny." She said he sounded older, deeper, calmer, but unmistakably her son. He told her he was alive, that he was safe, for now, but couldn't come home. Then the call ended abruptly. No trace, no recording, no number to call back. Police told her it was a prank. Noreen said it was her son. For years, strange letters arrived. Short, typed, unsigned. Each one referenced details never made public. Each one hinted at networks, at trafficking, at secrets buried under the surface of normal life. Every time, the evidence was inconclusive. Every time, the pain was real. Then came 1997. It was late, sometime around 2 in the morning, when Noreen said she heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, 2 men stood outside. One of them, she said, was Johnny. He was grown now, in his 20s, thinner than she remembered, with the same calm eyes and quiet tone. He hugged her, said he was alive, and that he'd escaped, that he couldn't tell her where he'd been, or who still had control over him. And then, before she could stop him, he pulled back his shirt, revealing the same small birthmark on his chest that he'd had as a child. Proof, she said, that it was him. He made her promise not to tell anyone. He said it would put both of them in danger. Then, he left. Noreen kept her silence for years, until the weight of it became too much. When she finally told her story publicly, the reaction split the nation. Some dismissed it as trauma and wishful thinking. Others believed every word, saying her consistency and emotional clarity were impossible to fake. And then, nearly a decade later, another photograph arrived. In 2006, an envelope with no return address appeared on Noreen's doorstep. Inside was a photograph of 3 young men, bound and terrified, sitting on a dirty floor. One of them looked like Johnny, older, but still recognizable. No explanation. No note. Just another image of pain, dropped like a stone into a still pond. The police again refused to verify the photo. They said it could have been a cruel hoax, recycled from older cases. But Noreen kept it, along with every piece of evidence, every scrap of paper, every shadow of proof that her son might still be alive somewhere. As of now, the case of Johnny Gosch remains open and unsolved. There have been no arrests, no confirmed sightings, no body recovered. only the unanswered questions, and a pattern of echoes that stretches from that early morning in 1982 to this very day. A boy leaves home with his miniature dachshund, a wagon full of newspapers, and a promise to be back by breakfast. The dog returns. The boy never does. And decades later, a mother still waits for a voice that once said, "Mom, it's me." Because unlike so many others, Johnny Gosch's story has no ending, only a phone line that might one day ring again. And while his voice vanished into history, the next one would break through captivity itself. A call not from the past, but from the present. A young woman dialing out from the very place she was being held. Amanda Berry, Cleveland, Ohio, April 21st, 2003. The day before her 17th birthday, Amanda Berry finished her evening shift at Burger King and started walking home. It was a short trip, barely a mile. She called her sister from a payphone around 8 p.m., saying she had a ride home and would be there soon. She never arrived. When Amanda didn't come home that night, her mother, Luana Miller, began calling friends, neighbors, anyone who might have seen her. By morning, she contacted police. Flyers went up across Cleveland's west side. The search stretched from alleys to bus stops to abandoned buildings, but after days of effort, there were no witnesses, no suspects, no sign of her. It was as though Amanda had vanished into the city itself. Then, a week later, the phone rang. Luana answered. A man's voice spoke, calm, low, deliberate. He said, "I have Amanda. She's fine. She'll be home soon." Before she could respond, the line went dead. The number was traced to Amanda's own cell phone. But when investigators followed it, the signal vanished. There was no way to determine where the call came from. Some believed it was a cruel hoax. Others thought it might be real. But no one could prove it either way. What no one knew at the time was that the man on the phone was Ariel Castro, Amanda's abductor, a local school bus driver who lived just a few miles away, in a faded white house on Seymour Avenue. Behind those walls, he had built hidden rooms, padlocked doors, and a secret prison where 3 women, Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight, would spend years trapped in darkness. For Amanda's mother, the call was both a lifeline and a curse. It was proof that her daughter might still be alive, but it also marked the beginning of her slow decline. Every rumor, every new lead, every cruel false tip kept her hope flickering and burning her down from the inside. In 2004, that hope was shattered publicly when celebrity psychic Sylvia Brown appeared on The Montel Williams Show. Luana sat in the audience, desperate for something, anything, to hold on to. Brown told her that Amanda was dead, that her body was in water. Millions watched, and for Luana, something broke. She stopped searching as relentlessly as before. Friends said her health began to fail soon after. In 2006, still believing her daughter was gone, Luana Miller died of heart failure, never knowing that Amanda was still alive, imprisoned just 4 miles from home. Inside the house on Seymour Avenue, Amanda heard the news of her mother's death on the radio Castro kept in the next room. She said later that it felt like a part of her disappeared with that broadcast, a final tether to the outside world, cut in an instant. Years passed. She marked birthdays by carving days into the wall. She and the other women developed small ways to survive, sharing whispered conversations through the cracks between doors, counting the footsteps that told them when Castro was coming. Then, after nearly 10 years, an accident, or maybe carelessness, changed everything. On May 6, 2013, Ariel Castro left the house for a few hours and forgot to fully lock the main door behind him. Amanda noticed. Heart pounding, she pushed the interior door open, but the storm door beyond it was still locked. She could see daylight through the glass. She began to scream. Her cries caught the attention of a neighbor, Charles Ramsey, who was eating lunch next door. He ran to the porch, saw Amanda struggling to break through the screen, and kicked the bottom panel open. She climbed out, barefoot and shaking, clutching a young child in her arms, her daughter, born during her captivity. Ramsey called 911. Amanda's voice, trembling, urgent, defiant, filled the recording. "My name is Amanda Berry," she said. "I've been missing for 10 years, and I'm free now." Police arrived within minutes. They raided the house and discovered Gina DeJesus and Michelle Knight alive inside. 3 women, missing for years, hidden in plain sight. The story shocked the world. A man who drove school buses, who cooked at barbecues, who waved to his neighbors, had been running a house of horror in the middle of an ordinary Cleveland neighborhood. And a simple unlocked door had finally set them free. Ariel Castro was arrested that same day. He confessed to the kidnappings, the assaults, and the years of captivity. In August 2013, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus 1,000 years. 1 month later, he was found dead in his cell, an apparent suicide. Amanda Berry's survival became one of the most extraordinary comeback stories in true crime history. The voice that everyone thought was lost forever, the same voice her mother believed in until her final breath, became a living proof of resilience. As of 2025, Amanda lives quietly in Ohio with her daughter. She has devoted her life to advocacy, working with families of the missing, becoming the voice for those who can't speak for themselves. Her story closed a circle that began decades earlier, with the haunting phone calls of Antoinette Cayedito, the messages of Don Kemp, the confessions tied to Nylene Marshall, the whispered call of Isabella Zabuaka, and the echo of Johnny Gosh. All different, all the same. Voices that crossed the distance between the living and the missing, sometimes as hoaxes, sometimes as horrors, and sometimes, like Amanda's, as the sound of survival breaking through the dark. Because sometimes the line doesn't go dead, it just waits for someone brave enough to answer.